Phantom Phone Lines Season 0, the show featuring carefully crafted, dramatized, voicemail message-style stories of unsettling, surreal, and perhaps paranormal encounters. Without further ado, let's hear what's been left on the line.
Hi. I've been listening to your show for a couple of years now, and I guess I've finally worked up the nerve to call in. I've heard plenty of stories on here about ghosts, UFOs, strange creatures, and all kinds of things people can't explain. I don't know if my story fits into any of those categories. Honestly, if you'd asked me 20 years ago whether I'd ever be calling a paranormal radio show, I'd have laughed. Where I come from, people don't spend much time talking about the paranormal. At least not seriously. They talk about weather. They talk about crops. They talk about equipment breaking down at the worst possible time. They talk about cattle getting through fences. Most farmers I know are practical people. You kind of have to be. The land has a way of teaching you that. Things happen for reasons. Sometimes you know the reason immediately. Sometimes you have to investigate. But usually there's an answer somewhere. That's how I was raised. My grandfather believed that, my father believed that, and I believe it too. Which is probably why this story has bothered me for so many years. Because it wasn't just me who saw it. It wasn't just me who couldn't explain it. It was 3 generations of men who spent their entire lives working the same land, and none of us ever found an answer that felt right. Now, before I get into what happened, I should probably explain a little about the farm. Our family has owned that land for over 100 years, at least as far back as anyone in the family can remember. The original farmhouse isn't there anymore. The old barn isn't either. Both were replaced long before I was born. But the land itself hasn't changed much. The fields are still in the same places. The tree lines are mostly the same. The creek still winds through the southern end of the property. And there's one field in particular everybody simply calls the home field. Every farming family seems to have one. The field closest to the house. The field that generations have worked. The field where kids learn to drive tractors. The field where grandparents point and tell stories about droughts and floods and harvests from decades ago. The home field wasn't our biggest field. It wasn't our most productive field. But it was the field people cared about most. It was part of the family in a strange sort of way. I learned to work in that field. My father learned there. My grandfather learned there. And according to family stories, so did his father. That's important later. Anyway, this happened about 12 years ago. I was in my mid-30s then. My father was semi-retired, which meant he was still working every day, but insisted he wasn't. My grandfather was in his 80s, still sharp as a tack, still stubborn, still showing up unexpectedly whenever he felt like checking on something. The wheat crop that year was one of the best we'd seen in a long time. If you've never farmed, it's difficult to explain how much hope gets invested in a crop. Months of work, thousands of dollars, an entire year's income, all sitting out there in the weather. Every morning you wake up wondering what happened while you were asleep. Too much rain, not enough rain, disease, insects, wind damage. 100 different things can go wrong. That year almost nothing had. The wheat looked beautiful, tall, golden, healthy. Every farmer in the county was smiling, which should have made me suspicious right there. Nothing ever goes perfectly. The morning everything started seemed completely normal. I woke before sunrise, same as always, made coffee, fed the dogs, checked a few weather reports, then headed out to inspect the fields. I've always liked that part of the day. Before phones start ringing, before machinery starts moving, before the world fully wakes up, there's a peace to it. Just you, the land, and whatever the day has in store. The air was cool. The sky was beginning to brighten. Everything felt ordinary, until I reached the rise overlooking the home field. At first I thought I was seeing a shadow. The sun was still low. Shadows do strange things early in the morning, but the shape didn't move. It remained exactly where it was. I stopped the utility vehicle, stared, looked away, looked back. Still there. Something wasn't right. I drove closer, then stopped again. That's when I realized what I was looking at. A circle. A nearly perfect circle. Flattened into the wheat. Even now, after all these years, I can still picture it exactly. The shape was so clean, so deliberate, like someone had taken a giant compass and drawn it directly into the field. Not jagged, not irregular, round, almost perfectly round. Maybe 75 feet across, maybe a little larger. Large enough that there was no chance I'd missed it the day before. I climbed out and started walking toward it. The closer I got, the stranger it looked. The wheat wasn't broken. That was the first thing I noticed. If you've spent enough time around crops, you know the difference. Storm damage leaves chaos. This wasn't chaos. The stalks were bent, carefully bent, pressed down in a spiral pattern, almost woven together. I crouched down and began examining them. The stems remained intact, still growing, still alive, just flattened, as though something had gently laid them down. I remember standing there feeling deeply unsettled, not frightened, just confused. The sort of confusion that happens when reality doesn't behave the way you expect. My first thought was trespassers. Somebody had made it overnight. That had to be the answer. But if someone had done this, they had put an incredible amount of work into it, and they had done it without leaving much evidence. I began looking for tracks, footprints, tire marks, anything. There wasn't much. The field edges were undisturbed. The access roads showed nothing unusual. I spent nearly an hour walking around before finally heading back to get my father. And that's when things got even stranger. My father was sitting on the porch when I got back. He had a coffee mug in one hand and a newspaper folded under his arm. Officially, he was retired. Unofficially, he still knew everything happening on the farm within about 15 minutes. I pulled up and shut off the engine. He looked at me over the rim of his mug. "You look like you found something." I did. "What broke?" "Nothing." "Then why do you look worried?" I hesitated, because I already knew how ridiculous it was going to sound. "There's a circle in the home field." He lowered the mug. "A circle." He stared at me, then shook his head. "A circle." "Yes. What kind of circle?" "Just come look." That got him moving. Farmers are naturally curious people. The land changes constantly, and unusual things demand investigation. Within 10 minutes, we were driving toward the field. The entire trip, he offered explanations. Wind, animals, a drainage issue, kids pulling a prank. He sounded exactly like I would have sounded if somebody else had been telling me the story. Then we crested the rise. The circle came into view. My father immediately stopped talking. I watched him squint through the windshield. Then he leaned forward. Then he slowly set his coffee mug down. The silence lasted longer than I expected. Finally he said, "Well," a pause. "That's different." Coming from him, that was practically a confession of uncertainty. We parked and walked out together. The wheat brushed against our legs as we approached. The circle looked even stranger in full daylight. It wasn't just the shape. It was how isolated it appeared. The rest of the field was perfect. Healthy wheat stretched in every direction. Then there was this one perfectly flattened section sitting in the middle of it, like an island. We spent nearly 2 hours examining it. We walked the perimeter, measured sections with tape, checked nearby fence lines, looked for tracks. Nothing. The deeper we investigated, the fewer explanations seemed to fit. By lunchtime, word had begun spreading. That wasn't surprising. Small farming communities operate on a communication network that somehow outperforms modern technology. By noon, neighbors were arriving. Some came because they'd heard rumors. Others came because someone told them there was something strange in our field. By evening, half the county seemed aware of it. The theories started immediately. One neighbor blamed a dust devil. Another blamed unusually strong downdrafts. One man insisted local teenagers had done it. When somebody asked how teenagers managed to create a nearly perfect 70-foot circle in the dark without leaving tracks, he changed the subject. Everybody had ideas. Nobody had answers. The next day brought the part that really stayed with me. The dogs. We had 3 farm dogs at the time. Not pets exactly. Working dogs. Smart animals. Confident animals. The sort of dogs that would chase coyotes twice their size. Nothing frightened them. One of the neighbors jokingly suggested seeing how they reacted to the circle. At first, I thought it was a waste of time. Dogs are dogs. They don't know what crop circles are. Still, curiosity got the better of us, so later that afternoon we brought them out. The dogs ran ahead as usual. Happy, energetic, completely normal. Then they reached the edge. All 3 stopped. At exactly the same place. It happened so suddenly that everyone noticed. The dogs stood motionless, staring into the flattened wheat. Their ears perked forward, tails lowered slightly, not tucked, just uncertain. I called to them. Nothing. One took a cautious step forward, then immediately backed away. Another circled around the edge but refused to enter. The third simply sat down, watching. The behavior lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then, the dogs wandered off and resumed acting normally. If it had been one dog, I wouldn't have thought much about it. Animals are strange sometimes. But three dogs independently reacting the same way, that got people's attention, especially because they weren't scared. They just seemed unwilling. Like they had collectively decided there was no reason to go in there. That evening, my father and I discussed it over dinner. He didn't say much. Eventually, he looked out the window toward the fields and said, "You know what bothers me?" "What?" "The dogs." I nodded. "Me too." Because secretly, it bothered me more than the circle itself. A crop circle could be explained, maybe. The dogs added a layer of uncertainty that felt harder to dismiss. The following morning, my grandfather arrived. He drove himself back then, a fact that terrified the entire family. Not because he was a bad driver, because he was 83 years old and refused to acknowledge it. I saw his truck coming up the lane around 8 o'clock. By then, we'd already had several visitors. Grandpa got out slowly. Not weak, just old. The kind of old that comes from decades of physical labor. Every movement deliberate, every step measured. He didn't waste time with greetings, didn't ask questions, didn't want explanations. He simply pointed toward the field. "Show me." We walked out together. My father followed. The 3 of us crossed into the wheat. For a long time, Grandpa said nothing. He walked around the circle once, then again, then stood quietly staring at the center. I remember looking at my father. He looked back at me. Neither of us understood what Grandpa was thinking. Finally, he spoke. "I've seen this before." The words seemed to hang in the air. "What do you mean?" my father asked. Grandpa didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the field, toward the old farmhouse site, toward land he'd known his entire life. Then he said, "Same field." I remember feeling goosebumps, not because I thought anything supernatural had happened, because of the certainty in his voice. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't recalling some vague memory. He knew. "What do you mean, same field?" I asked. He pointed. "Right here." Then he told us a story I'd never heard before. When he was around 11 years old, sometime during the late 1940s, a similar circle had appeared. Not exactly the same size, but close. Same field, same shape, flattened wheat, no obvious explanation. Back then, there had been no talk of crop circles, no television documentaries, no internet, no UFO culture, just farmers trying to understand something unusual. According to Grandpa, people talked about it for weeks. Neighbors came to look, arguments started, theories circulated, then eventually harvest arrived. The circle disappeared. Life continued. I asked him why he'd never mentioned it. He shrugged. The answer was pure Grandpa. It didn't seem important. To him, it had simply become one more strange memory among many. Until now. That conversation changed everything, because suddenly, this wasn't just a weird event. Now, there was history attached to it, a history nobody knew about. Over the next week, I became obsessed. I started digging through old records, old newspapers, agricultural reports, anything. At first, I found nothing. Then, buried in a stack of local newspapers stored at the Historical Society, I found a tiny article. Tiny, maybe 6 paragraphs, published sometime in the late 1940s. The headline read, "Strange Circular Flattening Reported in Wheatfield." I nearly fell out of my chair. The article mentioned our farm by name, mentioned my great-grandfather, mentioned neighbors visiting to inspect an unusual circular pattern. The reporter offered several theories. Wind, human activity, unknown natural causes. No conclusion, just questions. The article ended with a sentence that still makes me smile. Local residents remain divided regarding the cause. Apparently some things never change. When I showed the article to Grandpa, he laughed, actually laughed. Then he said, "Well, It was one thing to remember something, it was another to see proof." As summer progressed, visitors continued arriving. Some were genuinely curious. Others treated it like a roadside attraction. A few wanted it to be aliens. Those people were almost disappointing, because they weren't interested in explanations. They already had one. They simply wanted confirmation. I never gave it to them. The truth was simpler. I didn't know. Nobody did. Harvest season eventually arrived, and with it came a decision. What do you do with a crop circle in the middle of a wheat field? Leave it? Harvest around it? Drive through it? In the end, practicality won. Farming always comes back to practicality. The combine rolled through, the wheat disappeared, and within a matter of hours the circle was gone. Just gone. Months of discussion erased in an afternoon. Afterward, the field looked completely normal. The following spring we planted again, and life moved on. But here's the part that stays with me. The circle never came back. Not the next year. Not 5 years later. Not 10 years later. Nothing. Just that one appearance. Exactly like the one my grandfather remembered. 2 circles, 70 years apart. Same field. Same family. Same mystery. My grandfather passed away several years later. Before he died, I asked him one final time what he thought caused the circle. He sat quietly for a moment, then smiled and said something that perfectly captured who he was. I don't know. Sometimes not knowing is all right. That's probably the wisest answer anyone ever gave. Because if I've learned anything from farming, it's that the world is full of things we don't fully understand. Most eventually get explained. Some don't. And maybe that's okay. Do I think it was aliens? No, probably not. Do I think it was supernatural? I honestly couldn't tell you. Maybe it was weather. Maybe people. Maybe some unusual natural phenomenon nobody happened to witness. What I do know is this. One summer morning, I walked into the home field and found a perfect circle flattened into healthy wheat. My father thought it was strange. 3 farm dogs refused to enter it. My grandfather recognized it immediately because he'd seen the same thing as a child. And despite generations of practical farmers studying that land, none of us ever found an explanation we could agree on. Anyway, that's my story. Thanks for listening.
Hi. I've been listening to your show for a while now, and I wasn't sure whether I should call. Partly because I don't really know if this qualifies as a ghost story. Nothing attacked me. Nothing followed me. Nothing appeared in my room at night. There wasn't even a moment where I felt particularly afraid. At least not at the time. If anything, the strange part of the story happened afterward when I started learning more about what I might have seen. And even now, years later, I honestly can't tell you whether I witnessed something unusual or whether my tired brain simply connected a few unrelated details into something mysterious. But every now and then I find myself thinking about it again. Usually when I'm on a train. Usually when I'm looking out a window. And every time I do, I end up remembering that bamboo forest. I end up remembering what I saw deep within. And I end up wondering if I really saw what I think I saw. I grew up in a large city. The kind of city where you can walk outside at almost any hour and see people. There are always lights somewhere. Always traffic. Always noise. Even late at night. I know some people find cities stressful, but for me that was normal. That was home. The sound of distant sirens. The rumble of trains. The glow of apartment windows across the street. Those things were comforting. My grandparents lived very differently. They lived in a rural town several hours away by train. Not a village exactly. Not completely isolated. But certainly quieter than the city. Growing up, I saw them fairly often. When I was little, my grandparents would visit us every few months. My grandmother especially loved making the trip. She enjoyed seeing the city. Every visit followed a familiar routine. She'd arrive carrying far too much food. My grandfather would arrive carrying almost nothing because my grandmother had packed everything for him. My grandmother would immediately begin worrying about whether I was eating enough. Then she'd spend the next several days trying to prove that I wasn't. Every visit involved food. Large meals. Snacks. Fruit. Homemade desserts. Things she insisted I'd missed. Things she insisted tasted better in the countryside. Looking back, those visits became part of the rhythm of my childhood. You assume they'll always happen. You assume there will always be another visit. Another holiday. Another family gathering. Then one day you realize things have changed. My grandparents grew older. Slowly. The way everyone does. At first it wasn't obvious. Then it was. The train rides became more difficult. The crowded stations became exhausting. My grandfather developed arthritis in one knee. My grandmother tired more easily. Eventually the visits became less frequent. Then rarer. Then they stopped altogether. Nobody announced it. Nobody sat down and said this chapter of life is ending. It just happened. 1 year passed. Then another. Phone calls replaced visits. Video calls replaced phone calls. Birthdays became messages and photographs instead of shared meals. Life continued. University became my focus. Classes. Assignments. Exams. Part-time work. The usual things. Still, every time my grandmother called, I felt a little guilty. Because I always intended to visit. And somehow never found the time. Then during my second year of university, I finally had a break between semesters. Almost a full week. My parents both had work obligations and couldn't travel. I mentioned that I might visit my grandparents by myself. My mother immediately loved the idea. My grandmother loved it even more. The moment I called, she started planning. I could hear her excitement through the phone. Before I'd even finished speaking, she was talking about meals. She asked what foods I wanted. What desserts? What snacks? What fruit? She was essentially planning a week's worth of menus before I had even purchased a ticket. My grandfather got on the phone afterward. He tried very hard to sound calm. He asked practical questions. Which train? What time? Did I have luggage? But I could hear the happiness in his voice too. The trip suddenly became important. Not because it was unusual, because it had been too long. Far too long. The morning I left, I woke before sunrise. The city was still half asleep. The air was cool. The streets were quieter than usual. Commuters were beginning to emerge from apartment buildings. Delivery trucks were making rounds. The station was already busy. Train stations always seem busy, even when they're quiet. People moving with purpose. Announcements echoing overhead. The smell of coffee. The sound of rolling luggage. I found my seat and settled in for the journey. At first, I entertained myself the way everyone does. Music, messages, videos, scrolling through my phone. But after a while, I got bored. The scenery outside gradually became more interesting than anything on my screen. The city slowly gave way to suburbs. The suburbs gave way to farmland. Fields appeared. Rivers. Small roads. Clusters of houses. Occasionally I'd pass tiny stations where only a handful of people got on or off. Places that felt very distant from my everyday life. The farther we traveled, the more relaxed I became. Passengers grew quieter. The train itself seemed quieter. The steady rhythm of the tracks became hypnotic. I remember feeling comfortable. Sleepy. Not exhausted. Just pleasantly tired. The kind of tiredness that makes you stare out a window and lose track of time. Eventually we approached the bamboo forest. I remembered hearing about it vaguely from childhood. It was famous in the region. Not because it was a tourist attraction. Simply because of its size. The forest stretched for miles. When viewed from the train, it felt endless. A sea of bamboo. Thousands upon thousands of tall green stalks. The tracks cut directly through it. For long stretches there was nothing else to see. Just bamboo. The sunlight filtering through the leaves created shifting patterns. Light and shadow constantly moving. The effect was strangely mesmerizing. I found myself watching without really thinking. The window beside me wasn't perfectly clean. Years of travel had left faint scratches. Dust. Smudges. Tiny imperfections. The outside world appeared slightly softened through the glass. Not blurry. Just dreamlike. The forest seemed almost unreal. I rested my head lightly against the window, watching the bamboo pass, listening to the train, letting my thoughts wander. Then I saw someone. At least I thought I did. A figure standing among the bamboo. The sight barely registered at first. People exist. People stand places. Nothing strange about that. The train continued moving. I kept watching. A few seconds later I saw another figure. Then another. This caught my attention. They seemed unusually deep inside the forest. Far from the tracks. Far from any visible trail. I sat up slightly. Trying to focus. Trying to determine exactly what I was seeing. The figures appeared motionless. Not walking. Not working. Just standing. Watching. The train moved forward. More bamboo rushed past. Then I noticed something else. Stone. Straight lines. Shapes that didn't belong naturally in the forest. Low rectangular outlines. The remnants of foundations. At least that's what they looked like. The figures appeared clustered around them. Not many. Perhaps 4. Perhaps 6. I couldn't tell. The view kept breaking apart as bamboo flashed between us. One second I could see them, the next I couldn't. I remember rubbing my eyes, blinking, trying to sharpen my focus. Part of me wondered whether I was simply seeing shadows. Part of me wondered whether I was half asleep. The train rounded a curve. The scene vanished, gone, consumed by bamboo. And almost immediately I forgot about it. Not completely, but enough. The excitement of arriving took over. My grandparents were waiting at the station. My grandmother waved the moment she saw me. My grandfather stood beside her pretending not to wave. The moment I stepped off the train, everything else disappeared from my mind. For the next few days, life slowed down. And honestly, it was wonderful. I helped my grandfather in the garden. We walked through town. My grandmother cooked enough food to feed twice as many people. Every meal felt like a celebration. Every conversation felt important. Even when we discussed completely ordinary things. The weather, neighbors, television shows, family news, the simple things. The things you don't realize you'll miss until they're gone. Several days into the visit, we were eating dinner together when I casually mentioned the bamboo forest. I described seeing what looked like old foundations hidden among the trees. My grandfather immediately looked interested. Then I mentioned the people, the figures, the cluster of individuals standing among the ruins. That's when both of my grandparents exchanged a glance. Not a frightened glance. Just the kind of glance shared between people who suddenly understand what someone is talking about. My grandfather put down his chopsticks, then quietly asked where I'd seen it. I described the location, the bend in the tracks, the section of forest, the approximate distance from town. He nodded. Then he said something I'll never forget. There used to be a village there. And suddenly what I'd seen became much more interesting. At first, I thought that explained everything. Old foundations. Mystery solved. I remember feeling relieved, almost pleased with myself for noticing something that most passengers probably missed. But then my grandfather continued. And the more he talked, the stranger the story became. He told me the village had disappeared long before he was born. Not abandoned overnight. Not destroyed by some disaster. It had simply faded away over time. The younger people left first. Then the shops closed. Then the remaining families gradually moved elsewhere. Roads changed. Trade routes shifted. Jobs appeared in larger towns. Eventually there was no real reason for people to stay. The houses deteriorated. The fields returned to nature. The bamboo spread. Year after year. Decade after decade. Until the forest reclaimed everything. I asked if anyone still lived there. He shook his head. No. Not for a very long time. I asked whether hikers visited the ruins. Again, he shook his head. According to him, even finding the location had become difficult. The bamboo forest was deceptively dense. From the train it looked open in places. On foot it was another matter entirely. Many of the old paths had vanished generations ago. The forest had swallowed them. People occasionally tried to locate the old village, but most gave up. Without someone who already knew where it had been, finding it wasn't easy. Then my grandmother spoke. Up until that point she'd mostly been listening. She said that when she was a little girl, some of the older residents still remembered the village. A few even claimed to have relatives buried nearby. Every year people would leave offerings. Flowers. Food. Incense. Small prayers for ancestors. Nothing unusual, just respect. But eventually, even those visits stopped. The people who remembered passed away. Their children moved elsewhere, and the village slowly disappeared from memory. I remember asking if there was a name for it. My grandfather frowned for a moment, thinking. Then he told me. I'd never heard it before. Honestly, I can't remember it now. At the time, it sounded unfamiliar and old fashioned. The kind of name that belonged to another era. A place that no longer existed except in stories. The conversation moved on after that. But I kept thinking about it, especially the people I'd seen. The figure standing among the ruins. The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. Had I actually seen people? Or had I only assumed I had? Human beings are remarkably good at seeing patterns. Faces in clouds. Shapes in shadows. People where there are none. Maybe I'd seen nothing more than sunlight and bamboo. The dirty train window certainly hadn't helped. Neither had my exhaustion. By the time I returned home to the city, I'd mostly convinced myself that was the answer. The village was real. The foundations were real. The figures were probably not. Case closed. Or so I thought. A few months later, during a break between classes, I happened to remember the story. Out of curiosity, I started searching online. At first, I expected to find information immediately. A historical marker. Old photographs. Something. Instead, I found almost nothing. There were references to the village. A few mentions in local history forums. Scattered comments from amateur historians. An old map. But surprisingly little else. Eventually, I found a digitized local newspaper article from decades earlier. It briefly mentioned the abandoned settlement. Apparently, a researcher had visited the area sometime in the 1970s. The article wasn't particularly interesting, mostly historical information. But one sentence caught my attention. The researcher reportedly described the village ruins as nearly impossible to access. According to the article, even locating the site required a local guide. The bamboo had grown so thick that the remains were completely hidden from most directions. I remember staring at that sentence for a while. Because if that was true, how had I seen the foundations from a moving train? Maybe the forest had changed since then. Maybe a storm had cleared part of the area. Maybe the article was wrong. There were plenty of reasonable explanations. Still, the details stuck with me. Years passed. Life became busy again. Classes, work, graduation, moving apartments. The story slowly faded into the background. Then something happened. Nothing dramatic. Just a coincidence. At least I think it was. A few years later, I was visiting my grandparents again. My grandfather had become slower. My grandmother's hair had become completely white. Seeing them always reminded me how quickly time passes. One afternoon, I was helping my grandfather organize old family photographs. Boxes and boxes of them. Most were unlabeled. Entire decades of family history stuffed into cardboard containers. We spent hours sorting through them. Occasionally he'd stop and tell a story. Most of the photographs were ordinary. Birthdays, weddings, school events. Then I found one that made me pause. It showed several people standing outdoors. The photograph was very old. Black and white. The image quality wasn't great. The people stood in front of what appeared to be a small wooden house. Behind them was bamboo. A lot of bamboo. I asked where it had been taken. My grandfather adjusted his glasses and looked at it. Then he smiled. The old village. I immediately sat up. The village? The same village? He nodded. Apparently, the photograph had belonged to one of his relatives. It had been taken shortly before the village was abandoned. I studied the image. The people looked completely ordinary. Farmers, families, children. Nothing unusual. But I couldn't stop staring. Because for a moment, I had the strange feeling that I recognized the scene. Not consciously. Not specifically. Just a vague sense of familiarity. Like I'd glimpsed it somewhere before. Then I realized why. The arrangement. The bamboo. The open space around the buildings. It reminded me of what I'd seen through the train window years earlier. The sensation sent a small chill down my spine. Not because I thought the photograph was supernatural. Because it made the memory feel real again. The foundations. The figures. The clearing. All of it. That night I found myself lying awake longer than usual. Thinking. Questioning. Trying to reconstruct exactly what I'd seen. The problem was that memory changes over time. The more you revisit a memory, the less certain it becomes. Had there been 4 people? 6? 10? Had they really been standing still? Had they been wearing light-colored clothing? Or was I adding details afterward? I honestly couldn't tell anymore. The years had blurred the edges. Even now, I don't know what I saw. Maybe I saw hikers. Maybe local workers. Maybe shadows. Maybe nothing at all. The simplest explanation is probably the correct one. A tired university student stared through a grimy train window and misinterpreted what she saw. That happens every day. It's normal, reasonable, and probably true. But every now and then, I remember something my grandmother said before I left on that trip. We were talking about old places, old homes, old villages, things that disappear. She said something that seemed poetic at the time. She told me a place isn't truly gone while somebody still remembers it. I didn't think much about it then. But I think about it now. Because that village had almost vanished. The houses were gone. The roads were gone. The people were gone. The fields were gone. The bamboo had swallowed nearly everything. Yet somehow, generations later, people still remembered. My grandparents remembered. The old photographs remembered. The stories remembered. And maybe, just maybe, for a few brief seconds through the window of a passing train, I happened to see the memory of that place too. Not a ghost. Not a spirit. Just a forgotten village refusing to disappear completely. Anyway, that's my story. Thank you for listening.
Hi. I've never really told this story to many people. Partly because I don't know what happened, and partly because, if I'm being honest, people tend to assume that if you've spent years living rough, anything strange you saw must have been the result of exhaustion, drink, loneliness, or your imagination. Maybe they're right. I can't completely rule that out. But I know what I remember. And after all these years, there are parts of that night that still don't sit right with me. I'm in my 50s now. Got a room these days. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. Warm when it needs to be warm, dry when it rains. I don't take those things for granted. People who've never slept outside for weeks at a time don't always understand how valuable those things become. But back then, I didn't have a room, didn't have much of anything. For nearly 10 years, I drifted around various towns along the coast, picking up work when I could. Construction jobs, fishing boats, warehouse work, anything that paid cash, anything that lasted more than a few days. Sometimes I'd manage to rent a room for a month or two. Sometimes I wouldn't. Most of the time, I just got by. When you've lived that way long enough, you learn things. You learn where shelter can be found. You learn which shopkeepers are kind and which aren't. You learn which alleyways flood during storms. Which abandoned buildings are safe. Which abandoned buildings are dangerous. And perhaps most importantly, you learn how to tell when you're alone. People laugh when I say that. But it's true. You develop instincts. Not supernatural instincts, just practical ones. A building occupied by another person feels different. There are signs, fresh footprints, recent rubbish, the smell of cigarette smoke, a moved chair, a broken window that wasn't broken last week. You notice things. You have to. Sometimes your safety depends on it. The building where this happened sat a few miles outside a small coastal town. An old guest house, I think. Though by the time I found it, it had been abandoned so long that nobody seemed completely sure. The sea had spent years wearing it down. The paint had peeled away. The roof sagged in places. Salt air had eaten the hinges and rusted the locks. Most of the downstairs windows had been boarded up. The upper windows stared out toward the sea like dark, empty eyes. Locals avoided it. They claimed it wasn't safe. And honestly, they were probably right. But when you've got nowhere else to go and a storm is coming, safety becomes relative. I first discovered the place during a particularly wet autumn. After that, I used it occasionally. Never for long. A night here, a night there. Usually when weather forced my hand. A few other rough sleepers knew about it too. There was an unspoken understanding. No fights, no trouble. Everyone respected everyone else's space. The place was big enough for that. What happened occurred during one of the worst storms I can remember. The sort of storm that arrives long before the rain. You could feel it building throughout the afternoon. The sky turned the color of old steel. The sea grew rough. Gulls disappeared inland. Even the town felt different, quieter, waiting. By sunset, the wind had started. By dark, it was roaring. I made my way to the guest house just before the weather fully arrived. The walk there was miserable, rain blowing sideways, wind tugging at my coat, the sea crashing against rocks somewhere beyond the darkness. I remember being grateful when I finally reached the building. Grateful. Imagine that. Grateful to arrive at a decaying ruin. Funny what life can do to your standards. The guest house appeared empty. I checked the usual signs. No fresh bedding, no food wrappers, no recent fires, no voices, no movement. Nothing. Satisfied, I settled into a room near the old reception area. The ceiling leaked in one corner. The floor sloped noticeably, but it was dry enough. That was all I cared about. Outside, the storm intensified. The building groaned around me. Old timbers shifted, loose boards rattled, wind squeezed through gaps in the walls. I've heard people describe abandoned buildings as silent. They aren't. Not during storms. They're alive with noise. Every gust produces a different sound. Every beam seems to complain. Eventually I fell asleep, at least for a while. I woke sometime after midnight, not suddenly, gradually. The way you do when some part of your brain notices something before the rest of you does. At first I wasn't sure what had woken me. I listened. The storm continued outside. Rain, wind, the distant sea. Normal sounds. Then I heard it. A scrape. A long scraping noise. Faint. Above me. I opened my eyes. Waited. Nothing. Several minutes passed. Then again, a scrape. It was slow, heavy, deliberate, like something dragging across old floorboards. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was annoyance. I assumed another drifter had arrived, probably moving furniture or shifting debris around. The noise sounded exactly like that. Still, something bothered me, because I hadn't heard anyone enter. And in a storm like that, the front door made enough noise to wake the dead. I listened another 10 minutes. The sound came twice more, always the same. Scrape, pause, silence. Eventually, curiosity won. I've always been cursed with curiosity. It's gotten me into trouble more than once. I grabbed my torch and headed upstairs. The staircase creaked beneath my weight. My light swept across peeling wallpaper and water stains. The upper corridor stretched ahead. Dark, empty, silent. Then scrape. The sound came from the last room on the left, a room I knew, or thought I knew. The door had always been locked, every time I'd stayed there. Every time anyone stayed there, nobody had ever gotten inside. I approached slowly. The beam of my torch settled on the door. Old white paint, cracked wood, tarnished brass hardware. Nothing unusual. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. Then I noticed the keyhole. An old-fashioned keyhole. The sort you hardly see anymore. Thinking I'd spot another squatter inside, I crouched down and looked through. At first, nothing. Just darkness. Absolute darkness. The room appeared completely black. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw movement. Not much. Just enough. A shape, standing somewhere beyond the door. A shape darker than the darkness surrounding it. That's the part that has always stayed with me. Not because it was frightening, because it made no sense. How do you see darkness inside darkness? How do you distinguish one shadow from another in a room with no visible light? Yet somehow I could. The shape was there, motionless, watching. I remember telling myself it was a person. It had to be. A person standing in a dark room. Nothing more. Then it moved. Slowly. Very slowly. The shape leaned forward toward the keyhole. Toward my eye. Toward me. And in that moment I experienced something I still struggle to explain. It felt like recognition. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. As though whatever stood in that room had suddenly become aware that someone was looking at it, and had decided to look back. I jumped away immediately. My heart was hammering. I stood there staring at the door, waiting for something. Anything, a voice, footsteps, movement. Nothing came. The hallway remained silent. The storm continued outside, and somehow that made everything worse, because the world beyond the building carried on normally. While I stood there wondering what I'd just seen, I went back downstairs. I did not investigate further. Not that night. People can call that cowardice if they like. I call it common sense. I've survived as long as I have by knowing when to leave things alone. Morning finally arrived. The storm moved offshore. Sunlight returned, and with daylight came embarrassment. I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. A trick of shadows, a tired mind, a dark hallway. That's what I believed. Until I forced the door open, because the room beyond should have settled the matter. It should have proven I'd imagined everything. Instead, the room was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no bedding, no person. No signs anyone had entered for years. And most unsettling of all, the dust covering the floor was untouched. Not a single footprint. Not a single drag mark. Nothing. Just a smooth layer of dust stretching from wall to wall. As though nobody had stood in that room for a very, very long time. I remember standing there in silence, looking at that dust, then looking back toward the door, toward the keyhole, trying to understand what I'd seen. I've never managed to, and that's why, all these years later, I still remember that night. Not because I think I encountered a ghost, not because I think something supernatural happened, but because I don't know.
And after a lifetime of abandoned buildings, storm shelters, and forgotten places. That locked room remains the only place I've ever looked into and felt absolutely certain that something on the other side was looking back.
This episode is part of Season 0, featuring crafted tales inspired by folklore, urban legends, classic ghost stories, and the paranormal. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, don't forget to subscribe to Phantom Phone Line and be sure to share this with a friend who loves the unusual and unexplained. If you want to catch up on previous episodes, check our website at www.phantomphoneline.com for links and more information. We've reached the end of the line for now, but remember to stay tuned and keep listening for the next one, here on Phantom Phone Line. Any views and opinions expressed are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's producers, affiliates, or sponsors. This content is intended for entertainmental purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice or services of any kind. Viewers and listeners should exercise caution, seek professional advice if needed, and are encouraged to draw their own conclusions. Viewer and listener discretion is advised. Some content may be disturbing, sensitive, or triggering to certain audiences. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations is purely coincidental. Some parts of this content may feature elements that were created, altered, enhanced, or modified using digital production tools, techniques, or other advanced production methods, including synthetic or automated processes. All content is the property of Phantom Phone Line and may not be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form without prior written consent.